Welcome to the first meeting of the series Race in Focus. And today's session is devoted to critical pedagogies and with particular focus on the syllabus as our object of discussion. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the two speakers on today's panel. My name is Anindita Banerjee, and I'd just like to introduce our speakers with a very brief biographical note. Our first speaker is Amaryllis Lugo de Fabriz, who is the master instructor of Russian at Howard University, the only historically Black university to offer a Russian program, the Russian minor in Russian language and literature. Lugo de Fabriz obtained her Bachelor of Arts in Russian language and literature with honors from Brown University, a Master of International Studies in Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies from the University of Washington, Jackson School for International Studies, and a doctorate in Slavic languages and literatures from the University of Washington. Her research interests include Spanish language and literature, Spanish poetry, and cultural and cinema studies. Lugo de Fabriz is also active in the Montgomery County Council of Parents and Teachers Associations of Maryland, which allows her to be informed about the educational background and challenges her incoming students face. Our second presenter today is Sunny Rucker-Chang, who is an assistant professor of Slavic and East European Studies and director of European Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Focusing on racial and cultural formations and minority-majority relations in Southeastern Europe, Rucker-Chang's interdisciplinary research and teaching span Yugoslav and post-Yugoslav history, literature, screen media, coloniality, and post-socialism. Professor Rucker-Chang is the co-author of Roma Rights and Civil Rights, a Transatlantic Companion, published this year, 2020. She is the co-editor of Chinese Migrants in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, published by Routledge in 2011. She is currently finishing a co-edited volume titled Migrants and Refugees to, From, and in the Balkans, as well as a monograph challenging conventional ideas of race and racialization in the Balkans to connect the region to broader trends in European studies. Dr. Rucker-Chang's work has appeared in a number of journals, including Critical Romani Studies, Interventions, Journal of Transatlantic Studies, and the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. With that, let me invite Dr. Amaryllis Lugo de Fabriz to present.
Hello, good afternoon and good morning. I think it's still on the West Coast. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to go ahead and get my PowerPoint up and let's talk about critical pedagogies. So come on, there we are. So how to engage critical pedagogies, or how to engage race when you teach it all, right? I am the master instructor of Russian at Howard University, the only historically Black university that has a Russian program. And this is a picture of a group of students that came and did a special mentorship program for us. And it's one of the programs we are running out of Howard right now, courtesy of the US-Russia Foundation. So basically, until this year, when I got a new lecturer to start teaching Russian language, I was teaching it all. So when I approach my syllabi, right, the first question is really, what is a syllabus? And as much as we might want to glorify a syllabus, I want to be honest. My first approach to the syllabus is that it's an institutional requirement. I need to have it ready to go before the first day to turn it in. it is a reflection of the length of teaching. How long is my semester? How many hours? How many sessions? And the standard student, right? I do a lot of introduction to courses. So I tend to have a mix of those students that have already had classes with me and those that don't. Then finally, I can address the subject. What subject am I teaching? And last but not least, the topic. So when we talk about a syllabus, unfortunately, real life comes in. Depending on its place in your program, you get to figure out how these elements interact and how you get to integrate critical pedagogies into your program. So what do? So like I said, till last year, I pretty much taught it all, right? So how in depth depends on how much time you have. But what is even more important is that you have your frame of mind under why not, right? Because in the end, integrating these pedagogies will open you to surprise and discoveries. It'll turn inclusion into a natural event, and you will be able to be open to a lot of interesting comparative matters. So first question is, what are you teaching? Like, it matters and it doesn't, right? On the left, we have our ACTFL 5s from actfl.org, right? Communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, communities. Those of us who teach language and literature are very familiar with those. On the right are some of my favorite books from when I took some border studies courses at University of Washington, like Border Matters and Hybrid Cultures. So take your choice, right? If you want to talk about language and literature, if you're going to be serious about all 5 elements, particularly comparisons and communities, there you go. Looking at the whole idea of borders, right? If you think about Slavic studies, that gets in there. So my task, when I develop a syllabus, is a 3-year rotation for my minors. My goal is on-time graduation, right? And that's my #1 institutional requirement, right? And the picture on the left are some of my students from last fall. And this is a live course. I am teaching the 3 R's, Revolution, Rebellion, and Resignation. It is a survey of Russian and Soviet works that reflect political aspirations and disillusionments. It is focusing mostly on social sciences, but it also integrates literature. So my length of teaching, August 20 to Thanksgiving. No knowledge of Russian required, so I'd have to calibrate for that. And last, the subject. Can I integrate my students' cultural experience in Russia through Russian area studies approaches? The short answer is actually yeah. It doesn't take a lot of searching to figure out some great sources. For instance, here you see the cover for Russian the Negro by Alison Blakely, which is sort of the go-to alpha original source. However, there's a lot more stuff online now. It doesn't take that much. It just requires interest, right? So for instance, how it looks now. This are the W.E.B. Du Bois papers, and they're at University of Massachusetts, and they are digitized. And if you pop in Soviet, you get 600 results, right? So as far as integrating material that relates to the topic and that is real live, digital collections now make it really accessible. You can turn it into a great research opportunity for your students. So next sort of topics, right? So I kind of broke it down to peasantry. What was it, right? Decembrists, Bolshevism, the Stalinist period, and Putinism, right? And the course requirements. It is a live course during a pandemic. So short, sweet, to the point, right? I decided to go with very short writing assignments to make sure that students had an opportunity to show their mastery, but at the same time provide me with feedback, as you see with the journals. Those are mostly reflection papers, but they also write short critical analysis papers. Again, these are mostly starting students. The final project is the thing that we are gearing up for, right? They have research option 3. I'm going to jump to that one first, of course. The 5-page research paper based on one of the themes of the class. So integrate at least 3 primary documents into your topic. They also have the option to integrate themselves into one of our research projects that we are doing as part of our mentorship program, which is awesome. So experiential learning. Don't lose the opportunity for experiential learning. So then away we go. We put together our bibliography, right? So for Decembrists in particular, the material is actually more there than you can imagine. We have Mirsky's The Decembrists, and that is actually really fantastic because it talks about the concept of revolution as a generational thing. Pushkin, The Bronze Horseman, and then Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois wrote a lot about a lot, and he wrote this beautiful short article about Pushkin. It's a great biography, but also he talks about Pushkin's place as a person of African descent, which he was. So as you see, part of it is short time, pandemically driven, everything's online. We jumped then to Bolshevism and looking at the manifesto of the Communist Party, and we went into communism. And then we went to personal narratives, right? Like Marie-Louise Patterson, right? And this is available through JSTOR, Moscow Bound in Black and White, from the group that went to make this film in Russia. So students get to engage with real primary documents that talk about internationalism in the Soviet Union, right? I paired that with Agricultural Specialist Journey to the Soviet Union, Black and Reds in Russia. And of course, Jennifer Wilson, who has done such amazing work about African Americans in Russia, the Soviet Union. So definitely not a lot of thinking, right? As far as having real documents. And again, the documents speak for themselves, right? We are coming towards the later part of the semester, so we are actually going to look at Putinism. They've read a lot of Putin's foundational speeches, and we are about to go into disinformation. There has been a lot of talk about Russian disinformation, so I want to see what my students can make out of something that's really here and now. Particularly, disinformation has been targeted at communities of color. So this is a Russian strategy, and how do they relate this to the past ideologies? Oh, with the theory of how do you create regimes. So again, going to my Actful Fives, right? We are talking about communication, right? They get to look at different documents, primary, secondary, cultures, this connection between the Russian culture throughout centuries and the African diaspora, right? They make the connection with the primary documents. They have comparisons based on events, and they get to compare to communities, the Russian community and the African American community. So that is sort of one way that you can approach it. The benefit of it is that they get to do a lot of rich work, not just with theory, but with their own personal background, and make that connection. And as you saw, part of my limit was time. Given more time, a more developed program, it would be very easy to take this type of approach and do a comparative course with Latin American reactions and reactions of not just African Americans, but also other diasporic communities. The beauty again is that there's so many more documents now that are digitized, right? And you, in a way, it's making a benefit out of what might seem a great challenge, which is this is a syllabus that is really pandemically driven. It is all digital, and it allows students to really think about what does it mean to be African American in that specific historical context, and how does it reflect the evolution of the Russian state. So that is sort of the way to do it. And like I said, you just want to have the curiosity and want to do it. There's a lot of basic texts that are easily accessible if you want to think about different ways to do it. And as I said already, sort of my dream course would be to also integrate this whole idea of border studies, right? Saldivar, his remapping of American cultural studies, border matters, right? The whole idea of borders would be so easy to integrate into one of these courses. So that is how you can go ahead and integrate some of these theories. Well, the students don't really appreciate the fact that they're digesting these theories, and that's the beauty of it. By giving primacy to the primary document and the primary voice of the experienced life, it becomes much more engageable and relatable for them. So there you go. That's sort of how to do one approach to integrating these theories into a syllabus that is targeted to a more introductory audience in your basic introductory course. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Amaryllis. I hope the audience is taking active notes. We will do a combined question and answer session for both presenters after we hear our second speaker today, Sunny Rucker-Chang.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and get my slides going as well. And I just want to say, before I get into my presentation, I just want to say thank you, Anandita, for the introduction. To all of the organizers involved in this, I can imagine just how much work went into putting all of this together. Zuzana for all the help with logistics, the National Resource Centers, ACES, and the University of Pittsburgh for sponsoring all of the lectures that we will have this semester. So something about myself. You already have my introduction, so I don't need to repeat that. But in the past, I've taught a course on minorities in Eastern Europe and nationalism. I've also taught a course on screening minorities and what we can understand by the way that minorities appear on screen and the way that we receive them, sort of like coding, decoding. So, but anyway, so what I've done with this is it's a syllabus, but it's also sort of some ideas about ways to integrate content about race and racialization into the courses that you might already be teaching. And as has already been said, it's really about Southeast Europe. I'm going to minimize this here. All right, it's about Southeast Europe. And so the big question that we have to ask ourselves is, I think anyway, why race? And why are we talking about race right now? There's two things that I've been telling people. Anybody who's been willing to listen to me over these last few years is that I, as an African-American woman in Slavic and East European studies, learned more about race from my travels in Russia than I had ever as my experience in the United States. And the second one is that we have to engage with the frames of race in order to not just build out our frames of analysis and ways of understanding, but also it's a way of engaging with transnational theories, ideas, and we lose a lot. We lose a lot by not engaging with these themes. And I live with a PVB budget model. And the more students that we can get into our classrooms and the more that we can teach our own students this, the more beneficial it is from sort of a budgeting standpoint, but also as a field, we gain a lot by this. So what I've put together here, as I said, is I go week by week as to what text I would include in some of the themes. And, you know, by all means, I would hope that you take notes. Please don't hesitate to contact me, but we'll go through it. So why are we talking about race? And I have this great quote by David Theo Goldberg. Race refuses to remain silent because it isn't just a word. It's a set of conditions shifting over time, never just one thing. It is a way, or really ways of thinking, ways of living and a disposition. So thinking about race is actually something that is a lived experience. Indeed, it is a construct, but it's also a lived experience for race communities. And therefore, understanding race is not just one thing, but a set of conditions that make race or create race communities is very important for this. So just before we can get into really racial theories and theories of race, I think we have to sort of start where we were or where we have been as a field. And so I start with, in week one, these traditional frames of difference and otherness and how we frame them in Southeast European or Balkan studies. And so I would start with Maria Todorova, imagining the Balkans, and then, so that's Balkanism and nationalism, ethno-religious identities, looking at Milica Bakutaidens, nesting Orientalisms. And then there's these other categories that we tend to think about, kin state, kin nations, nationalism, autochthonous minorities, and et cetera. And with these frames, we're really working with nationalism and we're working with ethnicity. And I was putting things together for this syllabus, in some of the Romani studies literature, there's this great article talking about ethnicity and how in many ways ethnicity is both a marked concept and also an empty concept, meaning that ethnicity still marks people, and so maybe we need to start thinking about other ways. And so with that being said, I would move then from week 2, talking about ethnicity and nationalism, but realizing that there's more than just the nation and more to just ethnicity, and figuring out what those key points are that feed into that. And specifically, I'd be looking at scholars, and I should say as sort of an asterisk that this is not, sort of the be all end all, these are just some suggestions that I have. So how do we integrate race as a category of difference in Balkan studies or in Southeast European studies? And so what I've done here is I've put together some of the scholars who are working on race and have been working on race, right? So we have Catherine Baker, Dusan Bjelic, Ian Law, and Matthias Moschel. And these 4 individuals here have complementary perspectives on looking at race. In particular, this one here, Matthias Moschel, is, you will notice by the years, it's earlier than some of these other texts. And so he's looking at critical race theory. He himself is in legal studies. And so we can look at it in that way. We have legal studies, we have anthropology, we have history. And so just these different ways, because I should, the necessity for interdisciplinarity when we're talking about race, I think is very important. So race and transnational constructs. And so one of the big questions we have to ask ourselves is, what definition of race are we working with when we're talking about race, right? Are we talking about cultural racisms? Are we talking about race as conflict? Are we talking about race as power differentials? And I think that working through these various definitions of race with your students can help us to situate race both transnationally and as a transatlantic concept, because we're still talking about continental Europe in the case of Southeast Europe, but also to situate race within the context of the countries and the cultures that we're studying. Of particular interest, I think Charles Mills is very important, I think, in my work and others, in understanding how race works globally, and also in that regard, Omiwana, right? So racial formations, how do they function in the region, and what do we mean when we say race? Because race cannot necessarily cannot be one thing. So that's week 3. Moving on from then, we look at situated histories of race within the region. So eugenics and biological race. And so we have some text here from scholars who are looking at, so framing issues of health, hygiene, and eugenics in Southeast Europe, so very specific notions. Eugenics podcast, so looking at various media throughout this course. And then finally, I chose this text here because it's looking at commemoration of Roma in post-socialist and post-communist museums. And so how do we situate these communities that were erased by way of eugenics back into the historical narrative? One of the texts that I will be showing a little bit later talks about integrating Roma into the region with a capital H, not a little h, and that's sort of what I'm looking at here. And so also the legacy. One of the other important aspects of Southeast Europe and the formation of race is indeed slavery. When we talk about slavery in the region, a lot of times we talk about the fact that slavery was not indeed race-based, but in Romania, we can talk about this type of race-based slavery, and we can also talk about the slavery in the region that was not race-based, but continues to have an impact on those individuals for whom their race matters and is pinned to this history of race, of the history of slavery. And so here I have Alexander Lopcic, Magda Maktake, Anna Pavlescu, and Manuela Botazza, and Paula Royster. So, and this one in particular, this Paula Royster is a pretty relatively recent one. And well, actually, both of the bottom ones are, well, all three of them are, but sorry about that. But what you can see here is we have a bit of variation. We have some Montenegro in here. We have Albanian communities here. We also have Romanian here. So thinking about slavery allows us to engage with transatlantic notions of Blackness and race, right? And in that way, we can make these connections, particularly for our students who already have this knowledge within them in terms of the transatlantic context. And then we can sort of unpack the ways that they are different. How are they similar? How are they different? And why does slavery continue to be an issue for some race communities, but for other communities for whom they are not raced? So moving from week 5, we get to week 6, and historical engagement with race, so the non-aligned movement and internationalism. And when we talk about internationalism within Southeast Europe, the non-aligned movement gets a lot of treatment, but maybe we don't talk about internationalism as much within the Eastern Bloc countries. And so I'm attempting anyway to integrate some other literature here, and this piece by Magdalena Todorova on race, women of color, and socialist, post-socialist, transnational feminisms is one of the ways where we can sort of move outside of the space of only talking about the non-alignment and internationalism. But as you can see, I am fairly situated within the non-aligned movement. This piece by Ana Sladojevic is very useful in thinking about how we view race and how we can maybe think about how our colonized mind, so to speak, continues to look at race in a particular way when maybe those images were really pictures of solidarity and manifestations of internationalism. Week 7, whiteness in Southeast Europe. This is a topic that I believe is beginning, has a bit of a history, but is beginning to be developed more. And so if we're talking about race, we need to talk about some of the components of race, which in my mind are Blackness and whiteness. And what does that mean for this region? And in this case, we have the classic text by Aniko Emre. Then we have another one by Ian Law and Nikolai Zakharov, excuse me, and then Mary Neuberger. And I have Mary Neuberger here, and Neuberger. Even though maybe this text isn't written with an eye towards whiteness, what I want our students to do is engage with these traditional texts of Balkan studies, of Southeast Europe, through this new lens of race, talking about Blackness, talking about whiteness, and talking about maybe why we can frame conversations about these texts through race. And what does that mean? And what does that change in our field? And I had a double V in 7, excuse me. Week 8, so regional cultural racisms, marginalization in the Balkans. So when I started, I talked about what type of race are we talking about here, and therefore what type of racisms are we talking about here. And in my work, I try very hard to make sure that it's very clear which ones we're talking about. And in this case, we're talking about cultural racism. So again, looking at the traditional texts or some of the classic texts at this point, and looking at them through the lens of cultural racism, and particularly this nesting Orientalisms that most of us are familiar with, and looking at that through the lens of cultural racism, and what might we say about that regionally and how race is operationalized, if we can even make that argument, right? And then we have another one here, race in the Balkans, the case of the erased residents of Slovenia. So again, looking, sort of taking a very, looking at it very centrally within the Balkans. And I'm sure that there are other texts, but these are the ones that I just picked out here. Week 9, the global color line. And Blackness in Southeast Europe. So I've already talked about whiteness, so I'm talking about Blackness. And in talking about Blackness, the articles that I've chosen to focus on here are the ones that are primarily focused on Romani communities in Eastern Europe. And when I say Romani, I mean the various communities that are included within the ethnonym Roma. And here we have one on passing. We have an article that I have coming out soon, and I tend to not include myself in these things, but it is one that directly deals with Blackness. And then I have one here by Chelsea Westoheri that is situated in Albania. So we get Hungary, former Yugoslavia, and Albania here with a little bit of diversity in terms of the perspectives. Week 11, racism Anti-Roma racism and talking back. So this idea of speaking back to power and talking back to power and reclaiming the stories and the narratives that are told about you. So I have a piece here by Angela Kotze and Martin Rovid, Rome and the Politics, a Double Discourse of Contemporary Europe. And this piece is very useful because it talks about migration, but it also talks about how Romani communities are embedded into those discussions of migration and why that's problematic for these communities. And then we have a response to anti-Roma racism and the foundations of the Romani movement, or the Romani rights movement, and just the Romani movement in general. This idea from Anna Miria here, Yabi Rungbi Roma, Modern Roma Youth Activism and the Panorama of Romani Affairs. And then this last piece here, this is a just many different pieces that are, it's just a wealth of information. And then this idea, this piece here, nothing about us without us, Roma participation in policymaking and knowledge production. And in these articles that are embedded within this, you start to get a sense of the Romani movement, the actors within it, and the way that Roma would like to be represented within themselves. So allowing the Romani voice to be present within talking about Romani communities, and also very much a critical eye towards Romani studies. Migration and representation. And so then in this piece, I'll just sort of start to speed up a little bit here. We have Croatia represented, we have Bulgaria represented, we have the Balkan route represented, and Arab migrants, and this idea of the outsider. And in this case, this is one of these instances where the idea of racialization is coming from the outside, we get to have a sense of what are sort of the parameters of racialization as they are happening within this one community. And then finally, the refugee crisis within Croatia and the way that it is represented in the media. And that first article is about Chinese traders in Serbia. So thinking about how these new migrant populations are really challenging some of these traditional notions of the nation, of nationalism, of even the idea of autochthonous minorities and kin state and kin nation, and sort of unpacking some of these traditional ideas about what forms the state. Week 13 and 14, we're getting into this idea of screaming difference. So reading the classic text by Stuart Hall and encoding and decoding, and how we might be able to talk about films, right? And how we receive and how we watch them as opposed to maybe how another community watches them. Then I also have a piece by Maria Bogdan, who is a Roma scholar of cultural theory, particularly film. And then I have a piece here again by myself about the comparative points of African-American representation and Romani representation. And so thinking about how race communities are screened. And then finally, for the last week, I have a gigantic list of suggested films that you could incorporate into your syllabus that is looking at the communities that were embedded throughout the syllabus throughout weeks 1 through 14. And of course, I haven't talked about assignments, but that would really be based on what your students' preferences were and what areas you are teaching in. Finally, I will say that I'm really happy that we're having this conversation about race and racism and racialization, particularly in Slavic and East European studies. And I hope that the conversations continue and that we find ways to integrate these texts, these films, and these various media within our syllabi, because then it helps our field to be in dialogue with other fields, and it also helps our students from minoritized communities to feel a sense of belonging within our syllabi. And so with that, I will end, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our two presenters. As the moderator of this panel, will attempt to open up now our dialogue session with our speakers. And so while questions are beginning to come in from the audience, thank you again for actually, giving us all basically a course through your two presentations. I feel that, we have our crib sheets, We have our footnotes. As the audience, this has been a tremendous learning experience for myself, and I'm sure to our audience. As a person who is located in slightly different disciplinary space, I teach in a comparative literature department. It was for me tremendously liberating to hear both your presentations with its emphasis on how can critical pedagogy help Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies to interface with the world at large. And I was very, very happy to see particular concepts that I think have been theorized and thought about traditionally within the Slavic field. I'm a scholar of literature and languages, but these are thoughts that have migrated and flourished in fields such as history and anthropology as well, that to me constituted, if I now look back to your presentations, a kind of a set of keywords, I think, around which we can carry this dialogue forward. These were both of your emphasis on race or ethnicity for that matter, not as hermetic categories, but as contact zones, as border spaces. Amarilis, I really appreciated your emphasis on borders, because borderlands are fluid, they are open. So this is a way of opening up area studies, which is often seen, especially from the outside. It can look very siloed. And even within our field, you know, somehow there are these performatively autochthonous kind of fences, it seems, between the different regional focuses. And what you're saying is that actually beginning to think of race not as a category, and but as Sunny, you mentioned, but as a set of conditions in your opening slide, right? To make, you know, what seems sedimented, settled, and hermetic categories into mobile, open, dialogically penetrating. Yes, I'm being a little bit Baxinian here, but also going to Mary Louise Pratt, right, into contact zones, but contact zones which urge us to think very deeply about asymmetries of power. That part doesn't go away, that's always there. And asymmetries, I loved how both of you have opened up ways for ourselves when we are teaching our students in the context of the regions that we study, to open up actually, you know, access the digital revolution, and how that might be really mobilized towards opening up the field to students who may or may not consider themselves specialized or are doubting whether they can actually access this really, this thing that has existed behind some institutional walls for so long. So for me, that was a very liberating aspect, but concomitantly, theoretically, the way, especially that, that Sunny, you spoke about, you know, this entirely moving from categories to relations, to conditions, first of all, and relations betwixt and between and through, you know, race and ethnicity, which I have too frequently in our field seen devolve into a kind of a zero-sum game, to see that actually within the conditions of living and the contact zones, right, in which these categories get weaponized sometimes, that it is not, they are not also self-sufficient categories. So I was wondering whether I could get our Q&A and started with your maybe enlightening us a little bit more about mobility, right, and contact, if there were parts of your presentations that that were not as conducive to expanding on these concepts, borders, you know, all of those, again, really hard to pin down, always, you know, full of contamination and leakage, right? Concepts that how you think we might take those forward and run with them. Thank you.
Right, so I'll try and make a couple of brief observations regarding that. Yeah, mobility and contact. So I teach at a historically Black university, right? And to be honest, part of my challenge is to design a course that will appeal to students who have Spanish courses as their appeal. All right, so I am not tenured track. I am what's called a senior lecturer at most places. So I need to figure out a way to do it both with proper pedagogic thought and just frankly mass appeal, because there's the Mongol hordes in the Spanish class next door to mine. So I have to be honest about that. But also what this does is it's really cool watching my students, particularly when they get from that transition from sort of the Mary Louise Patterson, who, if you haven't read her narrative, do. She talks about going with like the Langston Hughes group that was going to do the black and white film group, but she was the secretary. So she talks about, they're gonna pay you, they're gonna give you first class accommodations, and then she writes about her reaction to all of that. And what does that do? Particularly that period in the 1930s, right? We have this now somewhat calcified history of what the African American experience is, right? So really short. You had slavery, then Lincoln, then Reconstruction, right? Then Jim Crow-y, right? Then Martin Luther King, then somehow integration, and then Obama, right? Particularly looking at the 1930s and looking at the period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, you get this idea that they were not going anywhere. There were all these laws. They couldn't travel. That, you know, you get the story of like the Green Book, right? What this shows was it wasn't like that. These highly educated, highly urban, highly cosmopolitan, amazing people were finding ways. And the Soviet Union was taking advantage of it. And this is where the question comes, really, like we thrive in contradiction, right? It gave them the opportunity. Paul Robeson was performing to full stadia. He sent his son to school in Moscow. That I call the super uber, you know, I've got 2 teenagers, right? I'm like, I would leave my child in Moscow for 2 years while I come and perform in the United States. Maybe not, but look at his world. So it creates this moment, not just of connection, of contact. You know, it definitely talks about those asymmetries of power. How do you grab power for yourself as a community when you're under those conditions? And then you start seeing that Soviet experiment in a completely different way. We thrive in contradiction. Yeah, they were bringing them because they wanted the propaganda of, look, smart, bright, African-American, beautiful artists, but at the same time, it was empowering them and the engineers. It wasn't just artists, there were engineers, there were mathematicians. It was empowering them to go do what they wanted to do and do it big. And we thrive in contradiction. I don't know, so that's sort of the fun part of it. And particularly now moving into Putinism and the whole question of disinformation, it actually yin-yang, right? What they saw as valuable back in the 30s is valuable again today. What does that mean in our postmodern, highly digital world? Yeah, and about the digital thing, one last thing, and then I'll let Sunny come in. Part of the thing is, Howard has about 60, last time I saw any stats, it said 66% of our students were on Pell Grants. All right, I am looking at students that don't have the money to spend $300 on a whole stack of monographs. They already have access to all these documents through our library. So again, a good thing out of a disadvantage, which is your tuition dollars at work. We pay for the subscriptions. Well, we're going to use them. So there you go. Hopefully that's a start to answering those questions. I'll let Sunny go.
Thank you so much. And I have to here add another name to our list that I have personally written about, and that was Claude McKay. Also, I just, if people are taking notes of pantheons, and in fact, I began to research Claude McKay during the first Black Lives Matter movement because his poem, If We Should Die, became an anthem. And then I was like, why does this sound familiar? And that was my rabbit hole into the history of revolution and McKay in Moscow. So thank you. Sunny, would you like to respond briefly? There are, I should alert both our presenters, several questions in the Q&A box, which I think they are still manageable enough that perhaps you could answer them live.
Yeah, and I'll just say something very briefly. I think that one of the most important aspects of studying race is this idea of asymmetries of power that you noticed. So many of us are reading Ibram Kendi or already had read Ibram Kendi, and one of the biggest, the final points that he comes down to is race is about power. And he's not the only one that says this, of course, but this is the language of, and it's thinking about what is appealing to our students, which I see some comments over there, and what they may be able to talk with. This is something that's fairly universal, right? So then we can look at the instances or the elements that add to this asymmetries of power that give us race, right? And then the local context. The other piece is the mobility and contact. This is also important because what is a race community in one context may not be a race community in another context. And you see this fluidity and this mobility that makes race something that is anything but a fixed category. So I will stop and then we can move over to the question.
I'm assuming you can see the questions in Q&A, both of you, and if you could take them in order, I can read the first one that demands an answer. The first one is a complimentary exclamation. So I'm going to move to Tony Cross's question perhaps and start with that.
Marilis, you can start if you'd like.
All right, I'm trying to scroll back to the first question. Sorry.
I could read them out actually, if that helps.
Yeah, and indeed, if you could read it, yeah, that would be beautiful.
Sure. So the first question is, does student curiosity / feedback factor in to the materials you present in class? And if so, how?
That would be a qualified yes. Howard is very proud of its Afrocentric curriculum, right? It takes its community history very seriously. So again, if on one side of my hall, right, I have Spanish beating down, with students beating down the door, there's also sort of the Africana studies side. It's part of the required curriculum at Howard. So it just feeds into that. So in a way, I am supplying other material that feeds into those classes and brings forth more questions that they can take to those classes. So sort of providing them with ways of seeing how Russia connects with those other courses. And the students generally, I've been taking students to Ohio State to Midwest Slavic before pandemic for about 5 years. And inevitably, time and time again, they went back to those topics. So if I have a student that's interested and willing to present at a major conference and do that, then yeah, I think that's a strong indicator that I should keep working at that side. Yeah.
Okay, so Sunny, did you have anything to add?
Very briefly, so the student curiosity and feedback tends to come out in their final projects. Usually most of my classes end in a final project. My goal throughout the semester is to give them strategies, and then I work with them throughout the semester to figure out maybe something that they really would like to focus on. And then with that being the case, a lot of times that's how their curiosity or their feedback gets funneled in. Now, if students are really, really pressing, through my experience, most students that I work with have very little exposure to Southeast Europe and the Balkans in general. But if there's something that they want to work with, I can usually try to figure out a way to at least work with that student, or maybe in the next iteration of the course, I would include it.
Thank you. The next question, I imagine both of you would have substantive responses to, is your experience with K-12 teachers and recommending materials or approaches.
I am going to tell you that is an incredibly hard sell. The easy way is to create a little interest group after school at any given K-12, and most schools will have you do their volunteer program, and then you can go in and do that. To integrate it into the curriculum takes incredible amounts of parent organizing and going to the school board. Basically, at Montgomery County, you have to go get it approved by the coordinator of languages, and then they pilot it, and then you need the significant numbers taking the class. So in a way, it's very parallel to my experience, which is if the numbers are not there, it's going to go away. So even in the 14th largest school system, we have, I think, one high school that offers Russian, which is really sad because we have one of the most diverse systems in the country. So sign up for your PTA, go agitate your local, this is local level stuff. It's your local school board. Go say, hi, I teach Russian. I think it would be cool for the kids, and get some parents going. And that's the short answer.
So I used to work at the Ohio State Resource Center, Slavic and East European Studies, as the outreach coordinator. So absolutely, with an exclamation point. In addition, I went back a couple of years ago to work with them on their K through 12 program that they have. And I spoke specifically on Romani communities and integrating text and literature about Roma in Eastern Europe to sort of expand the understanding of how we imagine and conceptualize this community within real life frames rather than our sort of romanticized image of an entire community. So yes, and I would also just sort of add, we have 3 local schools teaching Russian here in Cincinnati, and I'm working right now tirelessly to get a presence in those schools.
Thank you. A follow-up question, actually more. How can we make the leap from incorporating race into individual professors' syllabi to convincing the entire field, including non-racialized academics and practitioners, that they should be addressing race meaningfully? And I think I'm going to collapse this question into the next question from the same attendee. What is the case you would make to skeptics about the need to incorporate race into Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies? Do you think it's even helpful to expend energy trying to convince skeptics? This is a very loaded set of questions, and thank you for taking them on.
So I'm actually just going to jump in because this is sort of a pet project of mine on some level. So I've walked away with a couple of conclusions. Not everybody can teach race, and not everybody should. And with that being the case, I think that those people who are committed to it should teach the subjects, and people who are not committed are not going to teach it in a way that is meaningful, that conveys the meaning that it should. The argument, however, is one that I talked about in my presentation, which is, I'm sure it has different names at different universities, but performance-based budgeting is mine. So if you can fill, this is a very cynical answer, but it's absolutely the truth. If you are filling seats, talking about issues related to race, if you're doing it in a Russian literature class and you're doing a comparison, or you are talking about, so this is sort of sidebar on some level, but I'm incorporating, for example, Afro-Can, and I'm going to be teaching about Black Europe very soon at my university. If I can get 70 or 80 students into one room, and I can see that you can see that there is value for the college, for your department, that's how you convince people that this is a worthwhile subject. And this is, like I said, is a very cynical answer, but it works. Numbers change people's minds.
I would add that it would be good for the field to open its eyes and see that our student demographics have changed radically. in the 15 years or so that I've been at Cornell, literally before my very eyes, my classrooms look totally different now than when I started. So I think, I mean, other than, I mean, this is not a cynical, this is the non-cynical supplement to what Sunny just said, that those are our students. That's who we have at our institution. And if we refuse to engage, that would be upon us.
Can I just jump in before I forget? I'm sorry, Marilis. Very quickly, graduate students are demanding this knowledge. They really want to have this. I took a lot of classes in the English department when I was a graduate student because I couldn't get them in my home department. More graduate students are going to come, they're going to look different, they're going to demand more, and there won't be a space for this not to be included in the curricula. Sorry, Amber.
No, and this is hopefully generational change. True story. My first year of graduate school, let's just say I did not start at University of Washington. I ended at University of Washington because they were supportive of the fact that I already brought my Spanish language, literature, culture. I'm Puerto Rican, okay? And in a way, looking back, I could have double majored in Spanish easily, and I didn't because I was doing too much Russian. So, but I still took graduate courses at University of Washington in Spanish. That's how I got into the border studies thing. Where I started, they told me I could not use Spanish as one of my European languages. And they were, again, incredibly frosty about me trying to look comparatively into any Spanish projects, be it, I don't know, the Civil War, Cuba, you know. So part of it is, if you are an advisor, right? And even if you're not that familiar, just be curious, right? The necessary thing is for you to stand there and go, why not, right? Particularly, you know, we're talking about syllabi, but then this extends, if you really get your student interested, right? Guess what? They're gonna go abroad and they're gonna go to Russia. So even if you're not part of that, you need to be in that why not and be curious, right? And they might, I don't know, they might just lead you to your next book.
And if I may again supplement this very, very strong point, is the time has come actually when perhaps across the board in the humanities, we need to turn, just like Sunny suggested with the category of race itself, of fields as territories, we need to turn away from that and start collaborating. If you don't have any clue what your graduate student is proposing to you, tell them to go look for joint mentors, right? Rather than, again, put up a wall and say, no, you cannot do that. I think that this is crucial under any circumstances to go from the guru model of research into the network model, and at the undergraduate level as well. You want your undergraduates to be taking your course along with and together with your colleagues. Graduate training probably needs a major shift towards that as well. Okay, then we have a question, building from Tony's great questions. What strategies can students and junior faculty use to facilitate attention to race in this field from a position of less power / without receiving designated resources for pedagogical reform? I think it is a question about being, you know, a mover and shaker while being vulnerable and having no resources, which both of you seem to have a lot of experience in. So perhaps some words of wisdom, how to make a difference without any money type of thing, or power.
Well, first, be careful when picking a partner. I have to say, I would not be able to do any of this without, I mean, yeah, I will be completely honest. My husband has heavily subsidized my teaching habit. throughout my career. You know, that's one. And two, I've hustled. After this, Sunny and I are going to go to the opening session of our Students of Color Mentorship program. The U.S. Russia Foundation, I ran into their staff member at an ESSE's conference about 5 years ago. And he was like, we have money for educational programs. And I was like, really? So I wrote the grant and they gave me the money. So outside resources, sometimes, you know, and thank you, Ohio State, Berkeley, Pittsburgh. They have $2,000 here. A conference there have gone so far in my universe. So just, it's been looking for outside resources. It's been working for my students, and it has been incredible, absurd amounts of support from my family. Otherwise, I would have already jumped to University of Maryland, got in my Spanish master's, and taught at the local community college. Sunny?
Yeah, that's a really big question. So I feel like I've just been very flexible and nimble, and I'm in a university setting, right? So, and just finding my allies, figuring out how to make connections across my college, across other colleges, applying for group funding, looking for funding opportunities that allow me not only to advance my own research, but lift others up along the process. Conferences to highlight my work, but also the work of others. Half of the documents or the articles that I showed you in that syllabus are from people that I have collaborated with or who have come to my conferences or the conferences that I've co-organized. So it's about forming a community and finding out the people who are interested and who are going to push through right along with you, because there are a lot of us that are working really hard, and we'd love for our community to grow bigger, and we just, you know, come together and strategize collectively.
Thank you. Our next question asks about study abroad. So study abroad has been addressed a little, but I was hoping you could expand on how would you advise students of color interested in going to Russia? But are you worried about this the kind of racisms they might experience there?
So I'll start and Sunny will bring it up. So I teach undergraduates. I teach Black undergraduates, and I recommend that they go to Russia. And I remember when I sent my first group of students, it was a pair of them, which made me happy. And I have never, well, now we're in a pandemic. Before the pandemic, that probably was the most stressful semester in my life. I friended them on Facebook because I didn't have text back then. And just put them in touch with students who had gone before. So now that I have a pipeline, this is how it goes, right? My students start expressing interest. I have students that have gone. I know other students in the field that have gone. So I make sure I do not sign. If they want credit, I have to sign. And that's my power. I have the power of no. And if you have not gone and interviewed at least 2 scholars of color that have gone to Russia, you don't go in my program. And that's it. And I explain very carefully to my students, I pick programs carefully. I can control your home stay. I can control your classroom. I need you to interview these people so you can figure out how to get from your home to your classroom so that everything in between is just adventure. So this spring we had a panel at Howard about my life in Slavic. Sunny was part of that. So there you go, Sunny. That's your cue. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that, so I should start off by saying that I take students to former Yugoslavia and Hungary. Those are the places that I have taken students, and I think that the experience is a little bit different. What can I say? I think that we have to be honest with them. And I think that one of the students that participated in that panel and said something afterwards, which said that the racism that I experience in Russia is not so different than the racism that I experience in this country. And so realizing that maybe their experience abroad is not so different than what they're experiencing at home is really powerful, right? And helping the students to have that, make the decision to go abroad. But I guess arming them with that knowledge, arming them with what they're getting themselves into, allows them to make an informed decision. And I, from what Marilis has said, the honesty that we presented to those students did not cause anyone to not go abroad. They just had more information going forward.
We actually got 2 minors out of that panel, which.
So there you go.
So there you go. So they actually appreciated the honesty, and then we had some students pipe up and say, "Oh, and then this happened to me in Australia." So
Exactly.
it was not uniquely a Russian thing.
No.
However, I am still sort of mending some fences with my assistant director of study abroad, because she was sort of sitting there and going, "And I let you send students to Russia because," right? So that has been an interesting sort of educational process for her. And one thing she has observed is our study abroad providers need to do a lot better working with intergroup dynamics. Especially if you go, say, from Howard and you go on one of these major groups, American Council, CIE, suddenly you are in a predominantly white environment. And if your American classmates don't understand that maybe they need to pay a little bit more attention because you might need a little bit more support, and if they're not open to the fact that, no, you can't just go out at midnight to the club like everybody else for, you know, really reasonable safety reasons. Yeah, so there's a lot more sort of preparation for the groups that needs to happen to understand that they can be a source of immense support, or they can be the worst part of a student's study abroad experience.
Yeah, and I have to give a plug for also potentially going to other places as well. Yes, send your students to Russia, but understand that there are other places that students can go to study Russian. But then also, because the field is Slavic and East European and Eurasian studies, that there are other countries within Eastern Europe and Central Europe that students can go to as well if they're interested in the broader fields of Slavic and East European studies.
Thank you. We have our next question. What advice do you have for people who have mostly taught white students, but would like to attract more students of color and would like to incorporate more readings, discussions, works about race in the region into their courses? Would this involve more intentional outreach to other departments with a revised syllabus? How can instructors do so in a way that is also authentic?
So I'm actually doing this right now, and it's not a course specifically on race, but like I said, I'm teaching a course. Right now I'm teaching Introduction to European Studies, right? And in this course, I have an entire unit on post-World War II migration, for example. I have an entire unit on Romani studies, so Roma and the Holocaust also, and migrant communities within Western Europe, right? And then also an entire unit on internationalism. So you can have units within broader courses that attract larger students if you let them know that this exists. The other piece is that you can have courses like my Black Europe course that I'm designing that is cross-listed both within European studies, but in also Africana studies as well. And I think this is a strategy, and I've learned this from others in the field, that this is a way to increase minority representation in your course.
And also, let's not underestimate the power of low effort special programming, right? Like movie night with Russian chocolates, or better, Eastern European chocolates, all right? That's pretty low effort. It brings students who might, you know, tell your students, bring your buddies. And then the word gets out. Do that, do a little bit of cross-listing, and that's an easy way. As far as integrating it as a topic, if you're teaching the class, you can do it. You're the class instructor. Like, what, do you really have to go to your department chair to ask permission for every text that you put in your course? Yeah, no, right? if you have the opportunity and the freedom to cross-list, to put it in as a special unit, to put it in as an experiential learning. Again, W.B. Du Bois, those archives, they're digitized, 600 Soviet hits. Really, takes 30 seconds. Send your students to figure out what it means. Quite easy. Or just turn it into one sort of project about how does this reflect X, Y, or Z.
Thank you so much. That actually, I would say that you know, the pedagogical, what you can add to your syllabus these days is really no effort at all, right? I mean, things are actually movies, you know, down to papers, you know. I was looking at the Martin Luther archives, which are all at Stanford. They're all in stacks at these libraries to which your institution subscribes, as Amaryllis so brilliantly said. So, okay, the last question that I have on my feed starts with, do you think that the race perspective gains traction outside Western academe? And a second question, what kind of reception has your work received by scholars on the ground in the regions you are examining? I'm inclined to ask what lies outside of Western academe, because for most, you know, of the rest of the globe, I think it makes perfect sense. But so I'm just wondering what the parameters of the word outside are here. So with that qualification, I would invite our speakers to answer any of the two parts of the questions or both.
So in short, my perspective has gotten a fair amount of traction. As a matter of fact, before COVID, I tended to do at least 2 European conferences a year. I just recently recently is all relative these days, but I had a presentation in Belgrade in December. It was very well received in talking about Blackness and race. And I think it's really important to know that within the Southeast European context, these aren't foreign concepts, and these are questions that they are asking themselves. One of the challenges that I actually had was to, and I should sort of back up, is specifically with talking about the non-aligned movement, because it's a very vibrant topic within literature from the Balkans and scholarship from the Balkans. So these aren't foreign concepts. It's just that a lot of times when we talk about race, we tend to frame it within a Western frame of understanding. And that's precisely the reason why I say, well, let's look at it from within the context, within the cultural context, to see what the meaning it has there. I absolutely believe that it gains traction, and I should also throw some attention to Romani studies, which as a field does not question race as an analytical frame at all. As a matter of fact, they have, as a field, they're very directly engaged with African-American frames of reference and intersectionality. I'm probably saying too much at this point, but suffice to say, it absolutely has context and meaning outside of Western academia, and the reception has been really favorable.
So my perspective is a little bit different, because did I mention not tenure track? What does that translate? Yeah, no, that what travel funding? What travel funding? What? I teach 4 classes and work on outreach and mentor my students. And did I mention that PTA part? Because that's also important, right? My child's elementary school is 85% free and reduced meals. And 6 miles away, I have a school that's 2% free and reduced meals. Yeah. However, having said that, Latin American Studies Association, LASA, is the big Latin American, and it makes ASSIs look minute. You know, you go to Boston and we take only one. I went back to the same place and they took up all 3 of those hotels. That was absurd. And there is a very dynamic sort of mini group of Latin America Soviet study scholars, right? So that again starts complicating the question, because The Afro question in Latin American studies is incredibly touchy, right? And then you throw in the whole question of the Soviet internationalism. Will the real colonialism please stand up? So there is interest in that intersectionality. And what I have been able to access with my resources indicates that I better not think about what I could do with more resources, because then I'd get depressed.
Okay, there has been a lot of complimentary comments, which I'm sure you can see for yourselves. So I'm not going to read the concluding input into the Q&A, which are all big complimentary comments. So thank you very much. I have to say that I'm proud to be a part of those subgroups in Atlasa and also in African American studies. Somehow, just my 2 cents to this last set of questions is that actually, like, studying, you know, the former socialist bloc sounds completely logical to colleagues starting from East Asian studies all the way all over the global South, all over Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And nobody thinks that these are the outsides, which is where my question was coming from. Those outsides totally get what we are doing when we are talking about race vis-a-vis our field. So hopefully this will inspire all of us actually to do some outreach in terms of going just dialoguing with colleagues, students, and scholars in adjacent and not so adjacent area studies or ethnic studies departments and fields. This has been, once again, a tremendous experience of learning. I thank our 2 presenters so much for their hard work and their lively presence, and please keep in touch, members of the audience. And here we have the last slide that has all the details of the upcoming session, which will be on October 9th, same time, and on the topic of engaging with race and racism in the classroom with moderator Joy Gleason-Carew and the panelists Rachel Green and Chelsea West Ohueri. So I hope that you'll all come back for the next session and bring friends. There'll be Russian candy in our private spaces. And thank you very much to the organizers and the co-sponsors of this series. Thank you.